Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. I can't believe how fast Fridays come around, but I guess I still kind of appreciate Fridays, even though you can't go anywhere, you can't really do much. But there's just the psychological thing about it being Friday. It's just, and today I had a memory of remember the Oz FM Friday jingle that would always like kind of kick off the weekend? It's Friday. Wop bop blue bop, the weekend's here. I was stuck in my head all day, so I thought I'd share that with you so it would get stuck in your head. Um,
Let's leave Kathy to do the music, Rob.
Ouch. Oh, right in the heart. So welcome to Community Check-In, everybody. We're here just being goofy. And welcome to my guests today. Introduce them in a second, but I do want to just give a little bit of setup about what we're going to be talking about. Today, we're going to be talking about a very important topic at any time, but I think it's taken on added significance in the last year with the pandemic. And that is a conversation around grief and loss and trauma. Now, I've invited the people who are here with me today for a particular reason. We met each other under interesting circumstances. We met each other at a death cafe about 2 years ago, I think, in the before times, anyways. A death cafe, and we'll all say a little bit about why we were at that death cafe. But when I was thinking about having this particular conversation, the two people that came to mind almost immediately to join me for this conversation were Karla Hayward and Kathy Stock. And the other kind of inspiration for me to have this conversation is I just a couple of weeks ago finished watching the Marvel series WandaVision. If you haven't watched it, please go and do. You don't have to be a Marvel fan to watch it, but it's a great series. And really, at the core of the series is, struggling with grief and loss and trauma, and how if we don't deal with those things, they can, not only mess up our world, but the world of those around us. And so this is part of why I wanted to have this conversation today. You don't have to talk to someone for very long right now, and you realize people are really struggling. It's been a tough year. We've lost a lot. We're not sure that life is ever going to go back to the way that it was before COVID. People have undergone some, major trauma this year, losing a loved one and not being able to gather for a funeral, or gathering only with just a few people, being separated from loved ones for a year, having to work from home and balance a whole bunch of things, and being cut off from people socially. It's been really, really tough. So it feels like people are carrying a lot of grief, loss, and trauma. So we're going to chit chat about that today and about our own experiences. For those that may be joining us today that don't normally join St. Mark's for our community check-in, my name is Reverend Rob Cook, and I'm the priest at St. Mark's. The reason why I'm interested, aside from all that stuff I just said, why I'm interested in this conversation and why I was at a death cafe was 3 years ago, my dad died by suicide. So there was a whole long process for me to try and make sense of that and deal with it. And there was some counseling and a lot of work that's gone into getting to a place where I could talk openly about it and share my own experience. But then from that came a lot of other opportunities to share with people and have conversations. So out of that pain and that loss has come some really beautiful things in relationships. So I'm thankful for that. So I want to just take a quick couple of minutes for both Karla and Kathy to say a little bit about themselves. First of all, kind of like where they are in life right now, what they're up to, anything interesting going on, their favorite color, I don't know, wherever they want to go. So we'll start with Karla.
Thanks, Rob. Some of folks watching may know that probably the most interesting thing happening in my life right now is that I'm actually running for public office. So I am one of the Liberal candidates in this election right now. But That's definitely not what we're on here to talk about today. I think that even though that might be my circumstance right now, I am also the parent of a small child who, up until yesterday, was home from school because of the lockdown. I'm someone who is also working from home in this period. And just like everyone else, really, kind of trying to find our way through this second lockdown that has occurred after we kind of had a great time for 6 months or so with restrictions and things after last spring. So, like everyone watching, I guess, even though what I might be spending my time at during the days, I'm experiencing the same or going through the same commonalities that we are facing right now. But of course, outside of this, as I mentioned, I am a mom. I'm someone who's normally very involved in community work. I'm someone who has a ton of friends that I'm always seeing and whatnot. So this last couple of years this last year has been very different for me in that regard. And also, I'm someone who has a large extended family. In fact, last September, we were to have three weddings. So my sister, my cousin, and two cousins, sorry, my sister and two cousins were all going to get married at about the same time so that we could have this huge family reunion. And of course, that has all been put off. So it's interesting that all parts of our lives have gotten kind of tangled up in what this last year has meant. There isn't a facet of my life or my personality that hasn't been affected in some way, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Karla. Kathy, you're up.
Hello, my name is Kathy Stock. I will preface this by saying that I am home with many humans at the moment, and so a noise or a cat or a car horn outside the window is probably going to happen at some point during this conversation, so I apologize for any noise. So I'm a singer-songwriter, musician. In the great before, I was performing regularly in that arena, downtown St. John's, different venues, and released my debut album in 2019 in September. At that time, I suffered an inner ear injury in both ears, and I actually lost my hearing for a short period of time. So I wasn't able to promote the album at the time the way I wanted to. It actually all happened right at the end of recording. And so I postponed touring and promoting the album until the summer of 2020, which, as you can imagine, did not go very well. I also worked at that time with an amazing organization called Young Adult Cancer Canada, and did a lot of the helped out with a lot of the Shave for the Brave events, their major fundraising event. When the pandemic happened, all of those very public positions went away when all the crowds had to disperse. And so since then, I have become a full-time student. So I am working on a sociology degree with a minor in psychology. And I am hoping to pivot a little bit and still do music, but also work within some other passions of mine in the social sciences and trying to help people navigate in and through situations like we're going to talk about today. So I am excited to be here. Thank you very much.
So, Kathy, maybe you could just keep going now, and you could tell us your story or a bit of your story about what brought you to that death cafe that day that made all of our paths cross, and what makes you someone who can have anything to say really about grief, loss, and trauma.
Yes, so I must say, up until I was in my late 20s, I had very little experience with grief. I had a very privileged childhood. My parents are still living. I did not experience a lot of loss or grief in the majority of the first part of my life. I would say my first experience with feeling heavy, visceral grief or experiencing it was when I was 27. I was living in Tallahassee, Florida. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Big Short about the real estate market collapse, but we bought our first home about 30 seconds before that happened. And so within a very short period of time, our household income and our property value completely plummeted. And we ended up losing our first house. And that was filled with lots of different emotions. There was shame, an enormous amount of shame, embarrassment, fear about what the future was going to look like. But for me, grief was a major part of that experience, specifically when we had moved everything out and I was walking through the house for the last time. I remember laying my hands on the walls and just feeling this visceral heaviness as I imagined all of the memories I wasn't going to make there. You know, this was supposed to be my home. And also just hoping beyond hope, but also knowing I had no control over whether or not someone was going to have the opportunity to love it and live in it the way that I wanted to. And so when I was kind of trying to look back and go, when was the first time I felt, doesn't even feel like the right word, but experienced that? And I think it would have been during that season. Lucky for me, the next decade would bring about so many opportunities for me to experience that very same feeling. When I was 29, I was living back here in Newfoundland. Everything was going the way it should go. And I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I was in the best shape of my life. I felt amazing. I felt healthier than I had ever felt. My children were 7 and 2 years old. And I was, doing the gigging musician thing, evenings and weekends, and I was able to stay home with them during the day. And I was kind of living my best life. And because I had lived in the US for such a long time, I decided to go and, find a family doctor when we moved back to Newfoundland and get a full checkup, because it had been such a long time because I couldn't afford it when we lived in Florida. So I remember going to the doctor and being like, here's all my things, and just listed off, just random things. And one of those things was just like a minor pain in my stomach that I have every now and then that I had had for years. And so he ordered a scan for me. And of course, in non-urgent, medical care, slip came in the mail and it was going to be 10 months later. And I was like, that's fine. In between that period of time, I had really gotten really healthy and I wasn't experiencing that discomfort anymore. By the time the scan came, I was like, this is such an inconvenience. I'm not going to go. And my American husband was like, it's free, do it. So I went and got the scan done, and it revealed that I had several masses in front of my heart. So it wasn't related to the original issue at all. And I wasn't experiencing any symptoms at all. It was completely caught very randomly. And so that was very shocking. I don't think anything on earth could have prepared me more for a pandemic than a young adult cancer experience. Because, cancer is hard for everybody, no matter what age it shows up at. But for young adults, you're in this position where you're just starting your life and you're just gaining independence. A lot of people are dating, a lot of people are going to school for the first time, they're starting jobs, they're having families, or they haven't had families yet, so they have to consider their fertility. Like, there's so many things that all of a sudden you have to think about in your 20s and 30s, and it's a very different experience. I also, throughout my cancer experience, I did chemotherapy, I lost all my hair, chemotherapy dried my throat out a lot, so I couldn't perform and sing the way that I wanted to. It was, I couldn't be the mom I wanted to be. I couldn't do the things I wanted to do. It was very isolating because my immune system was gone. I remember going in and having my white blood cells checked, and they were like, you have none. And I was like, okay, how do we fix that? And having to have injections that, stimulate bone marrow and just make you feel every bone in your body. And it was just this, wretched experience that I couldn't have prepared myself for. But throughout, what I just kept hoping and clinging to was going back to normal. I can't wait for this to be done so I can go back to normal. And I can't express enough how grateful I am for my cancer story to be that it's gone. I hope that rings through, because I don't ever want to sound that I'm not grateful for that. Because I'll be 8 years cancer-free this summer, which is amazing. I'm so incredibly grateful for it. And July 11th was the day that I was counting down to, because that was the last chemo day. That was the day that my life was going to go back to normal. And when you put all your eggs in this basket of life getting back to normal when, and then that time comes and goes, and cancer comes and goes. And I found myself in the fall after really being hit with what had just happened to me, because there was so much chaos in it. There was so much, like there was an appointment every couple of days, and there was, tracking this and checking that, and there was something to do. It was like a full-time job for me at that time. And then all of a sudden it was done, and I was able to sit with what just happened. And that's when I found Young Adult Cancer Canada, and their entire, we call it YAC for short. Their entire existence is around isolation, like taking young adults out of isolation who are experiencing cancer in their 20s and 30s. And I really benefited from that as a cancer patient and as a person, as an individual. It was the first time in my life, or at that point, that I had sat across the table from someone who had cancer, but who wasn't twice my age. And it was really empowering because it was community and it took me out of isolation. One of the things, though, with being engaged and active in a young adult cancer community is how many friends die. And it's the ugly part of that. We say all the time that, knowing them and experiencing their life and having them in our lives for a short period of time is worth what comes after. But it's a constant. I get emails all the time that are titled with "read when you have time and space." And when I get an email that says that, I know somebody that I know has died. And it was I kind of went from having no loss of that nature in my life up to that point, other than grandparents who had lived very full lives, to experiencing it all the time. And being like 30 and 31 and 32 and knowing so many of my peers who were dying. And it's an experience that my parents have in their 70s and going into their 80s, that their peers are aged and they lose people all the time, but it's a unique experience for someone who's, in the beginning of their 30s, losing people all the time. And that's what brought me to the Death Cafe. So I worked with two amazing women, and one of them sent me this link to, it said, "Is this weird? Do you want to do this?" And so she sent it to me, and I was like, yes, and yes. I'm in. So we didn't know what to expect. Like, I had no idea what to expect when we showed up. And it was, for anyone who doesn't know what it is, it was this, roundtable discussion with people who want to talk openly about death and talk about it in a non-taboo like way. But it's also centered around art and the expression of, artistic expression around death and looking at the beauty in it, and looking at the, the fact that it's so taboo in culture, but it's also the only thing that's guaranteed. Like it's going to happen, and it happens all the time. And so that's where I met these lovely individuals. And that was an interesting talk. And I remember specifically remembering Rob, and it, because I was very actively involved in church. And when he said he was pastor of a church, I was like, oh, okay, I'm a peeps. And then he was also one of the only men there. It was a very feminine dominated group, which we could talk about for hours on a different topic altogether. But I remember just being really drawn to your story and what you talked about. And then we found out we had a ton of mutual friends, and it was actually crazy we hadn't met already. But part of my cancer experience was a faith deconstruction as well. And I had been a pretty active member and participant within, evangelical Christianity. And, starting with like the loss of all these people that I knew and who were beautiful and incredible human beings who were atheists and, believed in, worshiped different gods than I did, and who were dying and who I couldn't rectify, were suffering in the afterlife, started this like deconstruction process for me. And that's been really full of grief. I would say that my deconstruction in my faith has been the longest and the heaviest grief that I've experienced to date, because it's so foundational in the pillars of who you believe you are and the way that you believe God sees you and the way that you see other people. And all of that starts to shift and change. And I remember thinking, like, I'm taking the bottom blocks out of my Jenga game here. Like, the whole thing is going to fall down. And it kind of did. Everything changed. So many of my relationships changed. My marriage ended for a short period of time. We were confronted with, my husband was confronted with, things like addiction and mental health and all kinds of things. And I was confronted with my own codependency and how I am in relationship. And it just, grieving, but healing, and grieving and healing and grieving and healing. And it just couldn't have one without the other. And that for me, when I was asked to have this conversation, I was like, that's so poignant for right now in life, because we've been spending so much time alone. And I just thought about my cancer experience and the pandemic experience and the isolation and the deconstruction that causes inside of people, whether it's around faith or anything else, because we're alone, we're falling into internet rabbit holes, we're seeing so many things politically and racially, and we're trying to figure so much out while we're separated. And I can imagine that even outside of the physical grief of losing people to COVID-19, like actually physically losing people to death, just the loss of who we are in society and the many roles that we play has got to be really heavy for people right now. So I think that's the majority of my story. And yeah, I'm glad to be chatting about it, because I still have a lot to learn. I don't know there's much I can teach. I certainly have a lot to learn, but I think we all grow through conversation. So I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah. And I think, I didn't want this today to be a panel of experts.
Good, because you picked the wrong girl.
Right. I'm the wrong person, first of all, too, to even be in the same room with those people or on the same screen. Just people who've experienced. And like, one of the things I'm hoping will come from this is we can, discover new ways that we can help carry each other through these difficult times, not to make them go away. So you're like, if you're tuning in and you're maybe not a church goer, this is not going to be, a come to Jesus kind of conversation. We're not going to give you any pat answers like, if you just have faith, if you just go to church, if you just trust in God, everything is going to be better, because that's, pardon my French, bullshit. It's just kind of sharing from our own experiences. And I know everybody who's watching today is going to have their own experiences too. And, if you're comfortable while you're watching to share a little bit about maybe your own experiences with grief or loss or trauma, please feel free to do it too. And, so it's just the sharing is healing. Right? And speaking of sharing, in a little while, I'm going to actually share a song of Kathy's that she wrote that comes out of some of the experiences she just talked about. So next, Karla, tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure. I think, unlike Kathy, trauma and grief has been with me since I was very young. And I actually don't know if there was a me before trauma and grief. Like, I think it, much as your faith was foundational to you, oddly enough, grief and trauma and things were foundational in my life. I grew up in a home that was absolutely full of love. Like, there was so much hugging and laughing, and I always felt deeply loved. But I also grew up in a home where one of my parents had a significant mental illness and, most likely tried to cope with alcohol. And so my house was either very, very happy and loving, or it was absolute chaos and quite scary at times, especially when you're a child and you can't really contextualize things, right? So, looking back as an adult, something might have just been, my parents having an argument, but when I was a child, that was very scary. But I think what was most scary and most chaotic for me and most traumatic for a small child is that because my dad, when he was drinking or when he was in a period of experiencing bipolar symptoms, he seemed like a different person than the dad that loved me and took care of me. And so it was almost as though he would go away and this other person would take over his body. And so it's unreliable. And we all know the thing that children thrive on the most is routine and being able to rely that certain things are going to be a certain way. And so I grew up in a household where, even when I was small, even before anything major happened in our lives, there was always sort of this sense of unease for me personally, of fear, and of just things not being reliable and never knowing when something was going to change or go away. So that sort of trauma when you're very young, it changes who you are. And it makes you feel different than other kids. It didn't only change how I was, it was also sort of even in day-to-day stuff. Like, I would go over to friends' houses and they'd just invite you over. Like they wouldn't even check with their parents or see what was going on before they'd invite you over, because their house was exactly the way they left it when they left in the morning. But I never believed my house would be exactly as I left it. So I was, very hesitant to have friends over, things like that. And then when I was just past turned 18. We also lost my dad to suicide. And that was kind of my connection with Rob. Why I was drawn to you, Rob, at that event. I was following you around being like, oh, we need to talk, come back. Another child of suicide, right? Because I think even as much as we have learned how to talk about death a bit in this world, suicide is still a taboo. It's getting a little better, thank God. But especially when I was, my dad's been gone almost 25 years now. So you didn't say someone died of suicide. You said they had a hunting accident or they had a heart attack. It was just not said. So there was the grieving the loss of my father. Then there was what gets mixed up in suicide, which is that even though it's not true, you believe that person chose to leave you. And when you're young and a parent chooses to leave you, in quotation marks, that's a very weird experience, and not many people know it, and not many people can sympathize with it. And that is very isolating. And there's not a lot of people that you can talk to who truly understand it. And so for me, it was the grieving my father. It was grieving the idea that somebody had left me who was supposed to love me forever, which caused all kinds of well, does anybody really love anyone then? Kind of feelings. And also grieving my childhood, because I used to get called an old soul a lot, and I was, but it was because I needed to be. I needed to grow up quick, and I needed to be independent, or maybe I didn't need to, but I did. I chose to be, or I decided I needed to be. I needed to be very strong and not be childlike even when I was a child. So for me, there was kind of a lot of really unusual things around my grief that made me feel very alone in my grief. And I think bringing those forward in my life, because they happened at such a formative time, they became part of who I am. And so it could have been, and it was at times, that grief and trauma made me retreat from the world, or maybe feel like I can't fit in. But I also feel like it gave me, I don't know if I'd call it like a superpower or a talent, but I am very comfortable in the uncomfortable times and in the uncomfortable moments. No emotion scares me. People, whether they're deep in that throes of grief when they're almost insensible, that doesn't scare me. I don't worry, what should I say or anything like that. So I feel like in my group of friends, I've always thought of myself as the crisis friend, because when things go very wrong, I get a call. Like, I might not hear from you for a while when things are great, but when things go wrong, people call me. And I like being that person because everybody needs that one person. Um, so when everything happened last year and the pandemic hit, I think that I was equipped in some ways that lots of people weren't, probably. I felt like I could be there for people who were really struggling, even though I was in the middle of it. I'm kind of like, what else is new? Things are wild and wrong, but isn't that what life is, right? Um, so I think I was, able to be there for people in a way that was helpful to me, because as we all know, one of the best ways to help yourself is to help someone else, right? You take your focus off yourself, you can put it somewhere else for a little while. So that was really helpful. But also, in the 20 years since my dad passed away, obviously, I've done therapy and I've done readings and I've done all sorts of things. So I did have some tools in my toolbox that maybe other people hadn't had time to put in their toolbox yet. So those things were really helpful. And I think too, one of the things that was great for me was that I didn't expect a return to normal. Like, I knew we would all be changed. And like, yes, we'll go back to mostly normal, but I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to end so that we could all go back to normal, because I know there is no going back when you go through a formative experience. And we were all going through one, whether we wanted to see it or not. So I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to end. Like, I wanted restrictions to end and people to feel safe and all that sort of stuff. But there was no sense of, I got to get back to that way things were before. And I think that actually made it easier on me, because I didn't have a sense of waiting all the time. I was like, no, this is where we are now. I'm just going to move with this, right? So yeah, that's kind of my story, I think.
The reason why there were some smiles then was both my daughters were like walking through the shot here. People on Facebook couldn't see it because all they could see was just you, Karla. But
Okay.
and my dog was barking upstairs too. So. But first, I just want to say to both of you, thank you so much for sharing your part of your story, and just know that today the people who are listening were holding your stories very gently and holding you very gently and surrounding you with love as you do this, being very vulnerable with us here today, and kind of sharing out of your grief and your pain. And Karla, I think your superpower is empathy, right? Because I think that's what grief, loss, and trauma does. If we allow it, right, it can open us up to other people. If we don't allow it, it can close us off, right? And I think one of the things sometimes that can close us off when it comes to the kinds of experience we're talking about is shame. Shame and trauma fit together like a puzzle, and if you're not careful, it can really do some damage. Um, Before I play Kathy's song, um, trauma right now is a bit of a buzzword, right? It gets used a lot, and maybe people who are watching today are thinking, "What the heck is trauma?" So what would you say? And I know we're not experts here, and we're not going to give a textbook definition, but just from your own experience, what do we mean when we use a word like trauma?
I think that yeah, I follow a lot of you know trauma inspirational type of pages. I was actually, to be vulnerable, was diagnosed with PTSD a couple of summers ago, and for me, that fight or flight, like going into having a physiological reaction to life events that are either happening in real time or life events that trigger what has happened in real time. Um, but I also don't feel like any of us can define what is traumatic for another person, just based on, if you are an empathic person and you feel, not just sympathize with someone by feeling bad for them, but feel what they're feeling when they go through something. If you're a highly sensitive person, you can be legitimately traumatized by things that someone else who maybe isn't as intuitive would just let roll over them. And so the shame piece really comes into play there, because a lot of times people can feel weak or too sensitive or, you know, too vulnerable or those types of things. But I think if it's traumatic for you, then it's traumatic. And if it causes physiological changes in your body, that's something that warrants attention, and warrants care.
I think that's really important. I'm glad you said that, you know, people are their own litmus test for their trauma.
I find, I think one of the things that's different about trauma versus, say, a negative experience or a scary experience is that it changes you and it stays with you. So, you know, I know we all think about car accidents and death, and we all recognize those as traumas. But going back to kind of what Kathy said, you know, it really depends a lot on who you are as a person, your circumstances at the time. Something can, to someone else, seem quite small, but because you are a unique collection of experiences and personality traits, it just doesn't process for you. You know, you can't just sort of move through it and deal with it and learn a manner of, you know, organizing it in your brain as that's the thing that happened to me and blah, blah, blah. You just get stuck in this loop with it sometimes, and it starts to affect other parts of your life, and potentially it changes you, you know, forever in some ways. So I think that trauma is a thing that sort of sticks, and it has a long lasting effect on you. That doesn't necessarily even mean a negative effect forever, but it is a thing that changes you and can be tough to sort of move on from.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to play Kathy's song now. Kathy, did you want to say anything to introduce this song?
Yeah, it couldn't be a more fitting topic for this one. I was, and interestingly enough, we all met at the Rooms, and this song was birthed in the parking lot of the Rooms of the Rooms Museum. I had just played some afternoon music there, on the grand piano upstairs, and was hit with this wave of grief. And it was at the end of a really challenging year for myself and my family. And I got in my car and I started to cry. And I was so frustrated with myself because I had been months removed from what had happened. And I called a friend and I was like, what is this? Like, what is happening? And she said, it's grief and it comes in waves. And you can't control when those waves are going to come. And I said, but I've been working so hard on, like, I'm going to therapy and I've been working so hard and I'm so aware of it, but like, how is it still taking me by surprise? And what do I do to fix it? And her response was, it takes time. And I was so frustrated with that response because I knew it was true. And that just ruminated in my head for a long time. And so when it came time, I had one more song that I just needed to write for the album. I knew I wanted 10 songs on there and I hadn't really like picked them yet. And I knew I wanted to write a song specifically around what that process is like. And that's where Time came from.
Okay, so I'm gonna, unlike other community check-ins I've done, the music is not live; it's pre-recorded. So I'm gonna just get that up on the screen here now.
You wanna skip ahead and read the last page first, 'cause even if it's bad, not knowing is the worst. Summer will change to fall. Winter will change to spring. There is a curtain call for every song we sing. But it takes time. That's what they keep saying. That's what they keep saying. It takes time. It takes time. That's what they keep saying. That's what they keep saying. It takes time. She's prayed 1,000,000 prayers, but nothing's happening. It feels like there is no one up there listening. He's never felt this low, and there's no end in sight. He walks a darkened road, hoping he'll find the light. But it takes time. That's what they keep saying. That's what they keep saying. It takes time. It takes time. That's what they keep saying. That's what they keep saying. It takes time. For every scar there was a wound. It doesn't hurt like it used to. Hearts will break and hearts will mend. Whatever starts comes to an end. But it takes time. That's what they keep saying. That's what they keep saying. It takes time. Oh, it takes time. That's what they keep saying. That's what they keep saying. It takes time.
Whew. Beautiful, beautiful. Um, I love the imagery that you evoke there of grief being a wound. I've used that analogy a lot myself with when I'm dealing with families that have lost a loved one. That it's, you know, grief is like a wound, and it hurts a lot right now, and you know it's probably always going to be really sensitive, and that at times that ache comes back, right? Um, so thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
And Kathy just won a big award too. Tell us what you won.
It's a particularly humbling distinction for me. It was the 2020, which obviously was the year the world stopped, Inspirational Artist of the Year with Music NL. So huge thanks to them. And also big thanks to Peter Daniel Newman, because he co-wrote that song Time with me. So he's a great dude.
I know Peter. He's amazing.
He's good.
Yeah, we were joking the other day when the three of us were chatting, and I was saying we could all use an inspirational award for 2020. So I know our time is running out, and we could talk like this for hours. But I just want, like, from both of you, just one little, and I don't want to use the word advice, but like one little nugget that you could pass on to the people who are listening, either live, who are going to watch this later on, um, of what you've learned from your experience that could be helpful to someone now who might be struggling, uh, finding this lockdown, the second one seems to be particularly hard on people. So something that you could just, a gift that you could give someone today, other than your stories that you've shared.
Um,
You want to go ahead?
yeah, I'll go. Oh, am I lit up or is it? Perfect. I think it's not really advice, but I guess it kind of is. I think whenever you're going through something, whether it's grieving or trauma, our natural instinct is very often to step back and remove ourselves. Sometimes because we feel shamed, sometimes because we don't want to be a burden. Um, but I think sometimes it's motivated out of fear that we are afraid that we will ask for something and we won't get it. And so the only advice I guess I have is give people the chance to surprise you. They won't always be positive surprises, but don't mind read, don't future predict. Give people the chance to surprise you, and by being vulnerable and being open with your vulnerability, and being truthful with what you're going through, I think you're almost always going to be surprised by somebody who shows up in a way you didn't expect them to, or someone that you didn't expect them to, or something will happen. And unlike both of you, I don't come from a place of faith. So this isn't me saying, God will send a message to you or anything like that. I think that this is just a basic faith in humanity, and in community. And that if you give a chance for good things to come into your life, they will. So give people a chance to surprise you.
And Karla, too, before we go to Kathy, I just wonder if you could just say, because I know you're quite active on social media. We've had a fair number of conversations at St. Mark's and in the wider church about the challenges of that the pandemic has posed about not being able to be in the physical presence of people. Have you seen social media be a place where people can reach out to each other and help each other and to help carry these heavy burdens that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking about this the other day with a friend, actually, that I think sometimes it's actually easier to be vulnerable on social media, particularly like certain platforms. I think, like I use Twitter a lot, and sometimes it's easier to put something out into the world staring at a screen than it is to stare into someone's eyes and say that same thing. Or, where you can take a moment to kind of compose yourself and then put it out there. But I have seen it time and time again this year where someone puts something out into Twitter or wherever and people swoop in. Even if they're just saying, oh my God, I'm sending you whatever. Or, if it's someone who's going through, a financial struggle, or they need something for their family, or they need something done, by the time you see that pop up in your feed, 5 other people have already volunteered and you're like, darn, I missed my chance to help. And that sounds a little silly, but it's true. And I've seen it happen over and over and over again. And so, whatever it is that you need, I do believe that putting it out there can very likely be helpful. It's not to say everybody's comfortable doing that. And I know that. And I'm not preaching that everybody should. But if you're comfortable with being uncomfortable for a moment, again, I think you might be surprised by how many people are out there waiting to put a net underneath you.
Yeah. Kathy, what's your gift to people today? I know you have lots of gifts, but
I think the biggest healing lesson for me has been empathy over judgment. Judgment is such a crippling thing. particularly in a very social media dominated world right now, because I think we're very quick to jump to it. So we're really quick on our judgment and we're really slow on our empathy. And I would encourage people, and I'm walking this road myself because, you know, I have to catch myself and kind of, if there's something about someone that really rubs me the wrong way, I have to take a step back and go, 9.9 times out of 10, it's because they remind me of a part of myself that I don't like. And so the less we judge ourselves, and the less we judge ourselves, the less we're going to judge other people. And I think that the more empathy we have for others, but also for us, going through everything that we've just went through, learning a new normal together, the better off we're all going to be. If I can amend that too, and I don't mean to dismiss feelings and emotions at all, but for people who struggle with anxiety and are also isolated, I think it's really important to remember that feelings are not facts. So if you are feeling like everybody hates you, you're feeling like nobody cares about you, you're feeling like, you know, in this world where it's legitimately upsetting to people if they post something online and expect a positive reaction, or, you know, a mass reaction, and they don't get it, to take it so personally and to create scenarios in our own minds, because that's what isolation does. It kind of, you know, throws gas on this fire of you know, anxiety and trying to figure out what other people are thinking and getting it wrong all the time. So I would just encourage people that feelings are not necessarily facts, and the best way to combat all of that is exactly what Karla said, which is engage in community. Like, put yourself out there, allow yourself to be in relationship, because one makes people very physically and mentally unwell, and the other one helps people thrive. I think one can lead to PTSD and the other can lead to post-traumatic growth, and we're all just better together.
Yeah, I couldn't help, Kathy, when you were talking, especially with your first point there, to think of the great theologian RuPaul.
Yes.
If you can't love yourself, how the hell you love somebody else?
Yeah.
But, you know, like being gentle with yourself, you know, and giving yourself space and room, and self-care is more important now, like during this pandemic and going forward, than ever, right? Like, take care of yourself. Uh, you know, eat as healthy as you can, although it's okay to have a big baggage strip sometimes if you need it, but like, get out there, exercise, you know, find quiet time. We had a conversation last night about, you know, the pandemic and the impacts on the church, and somebody was talking about the one thing we hope doesn't, you know, go back to normal is just the crazy pace of life, right? Don't let that creep back in, because that could be really harmful when we're dealing with these kinds of things too. It becomes a distraction, right? You distract yourself from the stuff that you need to work on. So, you know, just take care of yourself. Really important. Really important. So I normally end these community check-ins with a prayer, but I'm not going to do that today. Well, it'll be a type of prayer. What I want each of you to do now is just, you know, very quickly, just tell us something that fills you with hope right now. And so that will be our prayer, right? That sense of hope, that sense of moving forward, that sense of, you know, kind of moving forward together, that will be our prayer. So what fills you with hope in this crazy mixed up world that we're living in right
I'll go first, I guess. The thing that one of the things that I've found so made me so happy over the last year is that we all did the right thing, and we kept doing the right thing. You know, like even people who were disproportionately affected by, say, lockdowns, or our rotational workers, for instance, who had to go in isolation and, you know, over and over and over again. Everybody in this province kept doing the right thing. And again, with our most recent lockdown, everybody just did it. And that's not true everywhere in the world. You know, it's not true in other parts of Canada. It's not true in other countries. And I have found that so hopeful because it just tells me that all the things we've been telling ourselves, you know, about the spirit of the people of Newfoundland and Labrador is true. You know, yeah, we're going to get in rackets with each other and we don't always agree. And there's lots of people out there who aren't being particularly nice to one another. But when the chips are down, we all put our shoulder into it. And I am very hopeful that that is going to keep happening and that we are going to come out the other side of this. Not necessarily in, you know, the same way we went in, but proud of ourselves and thankful to our own community and you know, confident that we will be able to face whatever comes our way as a community.
Yeah, and we really had two of those reminders in 2020, because if you think way back to Snowmageddon, was that exact kind of community spirit was what kind of bubbled to the surface, and was a good reminder for me at the time that, you know what, this is still a good place with a lot of really beautiful people who care about each other, and that we are there for each other when it's really called for. So yeah, it's a real blessing to live in a place like this, and the pandemic has just reminded us again, that, you know, as much as we complain about the weather and the price of gas, all that stuff, it's a good place. Kathy?
Yeah, I echo that completely. I think that Mr. Rogers quote of looking for the helpers, just, and that's kind of, you know, the beauty and the symbiotic relationship of things that cause trauma and grief. They often also bring out the collective best in humanity, through the helpers. And I think every time I see people rally around something, and I think like watching my children and how different that experience is of being a kid now versus even when I was a kid, which wasn't that long ago. I'm so encouraged by the things that they know and the things that they already embody that has taken me 35 years to figure out. I'm really encouraged by who's coming up next, for sure.
I would say the same thing. And I actually said the same thing last night, because I asked the exact same question to the panel conversation we had last night. What fills you with hope? And I said, my kids and the younger generation, the millennials and the Gen Zs, whatever they're called these days, they're so compassionate and so, you know, focused on justice. Um, they care about the planet and they care about the future of, you know, all this stuff we've built up. And you know, I'm a Gen Xer. Like we're pretty selfish. We tend to just care about ourselves.
We're self-reliant because we were latchkey kids. So it's different.
Yeah. That'll be something for part 2 of this conversation. But like my kids, the younger generation, just fill me with so much hope, that, you know, if we can provide them some space, they're going to make a big impact, on the world. So that fills me with hope too. Thank you both so much for being here today, for being vulnerable, and for being just generous with your story and with your experiences. We really, really appreciate it. You've helped, no doubt, a lot of people today. So thank you again. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Normally there's a lot of questions and comments and that kind of stuff, but I think people were just enthralled with your stories and with Kathy's beautiful song. So thank you, everyone. Take care. God bless and hold fast.
Thank you.